Hi, John.
Good afternoon, Barry. Hey, we're going to discuss defense today. I've been reading lately about all the challenges our military faces because we're not producing enough weapons, and now we're in a condition where if we're attacked, I'm not sure we have the fiscal space to ramp up doing even more quickly.
Yeah, I think that at this point, there are many people, and I would put myself in this group, who feel that debt is now the greatest threat to our national security because the unconstrained growth of debt is now, under current law and current rules of the game, it's just constraining everything that we can do, including defense spending. And as we've talked about this many times, I think the fundamental flaw here is we don't have a budget. What we have is a spending program.
Yeah.
And I think historically, we had a budget constraint. Everybody agreed that budget should be balanced, that expenditures brought into balance with revenues. And we were able to deal with military spending within that constraint. And by that, I mean, if you look back historically, we might run deficits and incur debt in wartime, but it was supposed to balance the budget or generate a surplus. And that was true after the First World War, the Second World War, and of course, after the Cold War. In each case, I think the incredible thing is the market system basically shifted from a wartime to a peacetime economy. And of course, cutting spending at that point to balance the budget, defense spending included. So we seem to have abandoned all that over the last 2 decades. And that's the fatal flaw, I think.
Yeah, unfortunately, you might be right on the fatal. And we didn't make this up either. A couple of years ago, which means $4 trillion, and probably a couple of interest rate points ago, we heard it was either a general or an admiral make that point to us at the meeting. So the people at the Pentagon, at least some of them, have figured this out for themselves, and yeah, they're just kind of hanging in the wind because they'll be attacked first.
Well, and I think what's happened, I think it goes back to the 1970s when I think that that's the point where suddenly we decided we could have both guns, right? We could just spend, and of course the 70s we incurred deficits to spend more on both defense and non-defense. Now we managed to balance the budget in the 1990s, but over the last 2 decades, we have not balanced the budget. In any year, we've just accumulated deficits and debt. And in fact, the rules of the game, the statutory rules that were in place required that increases in defense spending must be increased to match increases in non-defense spending. That was part of the rules of the game. That's the most ridiculous rationale for spending I've ever heard. Obviously, there may be periods when we have military conflict and we need to bump up defense spending, but then there's no reason why defense spending should match non-defense spending every single year, which is what that law required. So, as you and I have talked about frequently, I think we have to go back to the rules of the game. And I think you and I agree on this. There has to be a rule in the Constitution that mandates a balanced budget, not annually, but over the business cycle. And then once you have a budget constraint, the government has to set priorities, defense spending, non-defense spending, and you cut spending across the board whenever you're not meeting these balanced budget requirements. So that's the fatal flaw. Our rules of the game are simply not working.
We've heard people like John McCain say that our defense spending is extremely inefficient as well. That's something we can no longer afford. We need a plan in a lot of places to take on the special interests that are keeping the fat in the former budget, now spending plan. And we just can't afford that kind of nonsense anymore.
Well, actually, what the Defense Department comes up with annually or biannually, I've forgotten, is a defense budget that meets defense needs. They lay out the goals for defense, and then they estimate how much they would need to achieve those goals. Congress ignores it. Pays no attention to it. And Congress spends whatever they want to spend on defense. And of course, that reflects all this rent seeking and special interests. And we have to have a military base in our city and so on. It's just ridiculous. And I think the military folks, Bill Owens, or Admiral Owens, has said this frequently. There are a lot of defense hawks out there, but our defense spending could probably be significantly lower than it is, even with the current military threats. But nobody's willing to make those hard decisions in Congress.
Yeah, the symptoms of our already declared fiscal crisis have not yet worsened to get us to that point. But that is whatever that means in terms of bad symptoms. That's where we need to be, sadly, to break a lot of these log jams, to take these things seriously and start to budget and budget wisely.
Well, as you know, I think I'm working with some groups that are attempting to amend the Constitution to impose fiscal rules, the kind of fiscal rules you and I have worked on. And I think what we may find is ultimately the states are going to have to impose this on the federal government. The federal government is never going to impose these kinds of budget constraints. So I think that it may sound like a Hail Mary, but the states can amend the Constitution under Article 5. And one of the first things that should happen, I think, is an amendment that basically requires balancing the budget over the near term, over the business cycle. And I think with a constitutional rule in place, then we could take a critical look at all these areas of spending, including defense. And we might find that with that rule in place, where Congress has to set priorities, defense spending may come out even better than it does under current law.
Well, I think so. From what I've been reading recently, some of our supply chains, military supply chains, are woefully inadequate. It's painfully laughable that the Navy, for example, is producing 12 Standard missiles a year. I mean, they can fire that off in 15 minutes. And we're able to produce only 2 attack submarines per year. And I think we promised one of those to Australia each year. And, without the fiscal space to quickly borrow money, taxation takes time. We could, as the first George Bush said, we could be in deep doo-doo. Now we'll have to pick it up for our audience next week on more discussion of the consequences of the fiscal cliff.